Alrighty. Hey, friends. Welcome to people who are already here. We're just waiting for Mr. Fadiman to join us. Welcome, everybody. Art, Mac, Marley, Nicole, Ryan, everybody's here. Thank you so much for showing up. Really, really glad to see everybody pouring in. Still waiting on Mr. Fadiman. He should be any moment. Hey, everybody, still rolling in. Welcome, welcome. Andrew, Cassandra, John. Greetings from Detroit. Thanks, Ryan. Glad you're here, man. We're really excited to get to do this. Has anybody read, just curious, has anybody read Fadiman's new book? Has anyone read Your Symphony of Selves? Throw it up in the chat. Art, yes, this one right here. It's amazing. Isn't it incredible? It's really incredible. Welcome, everybody still showing up. We're going to start the live stream to Facebook here. As soon as Fadiman comes, I'll just press this button, live on Facebook. They make it so easy. We're all living our lives in Zoom now, so I guess it should be that way. Looks like there was a hand that was raised. Oh, there he is. Let's go ahead and promote Mr. Fadiman to panelist. There he is. Okay. James, are you with us? Yes. There he is.
Yes.
Hello.
Okay.
Hey.
I am. Who's us?
Here in the digital space. So it's only me on the screen, but we've got some attendees pouring in. We're going to give it another 2 minutes, and then we'll go live on Facebook.
All right.
Sweet. I love that. I love the room that you're in. It looks like such a trove of wisdom. There's just like wall-to-wall books. It's
this is what people used to do before social media.
Now we're all a bit lost. We're like, what do we do without our glowing screens or glowing rectangles? Where people.
I saw a lovely cartoon of a like 6 or 7 year old child, and there's a book on the table, and his mother goes by and says, "No, you don't need a password. You just open it."
It's like, would you unlock this for me? I can't get it. I can't get it open. And James, do you prefer James or Jim?
Jim.
Jim. Okay, Jim. Yeah, it says James on your book, but we'll go with Jim.
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for doing this. I'm really excited to get to talk to you. Really excited that you're here in this digital space. I feel really lucky to get to be across from you in this way.
Well, I'm very, very pleased to be here.
I was really surprised when you responded to that first email that I sent you.
Well, let's say I've as a graduate student working on psychedelics and basically having to keep a lot of my life invisible from the faculty, it's kind of nice to know that across the country people are doing psychedelic research or personal work, and they just say, well, yeah, that's what I'm doing. What are you doing? Oh, you're canoeing? Well, I'm doing psychedelics. or I'm living in a van half the time in the wilderness.
Yeah, I was really pleasantly surprised when you had your email at the back of Psychedelic Explorers guide. I was like, man, I don't. It feels like a long shot, but I gotta at least try. And I was almost embarrassed about that email because I had just come from ceremony. I was like, oh, honor to the elders. So grateful that you exist.
That was okay. Yeah, I admit the elder stuff doesn't get to me yet, because it's a curious thing. As you get older, your insides don't. And so, I look in the mirror, I think, who is that old guy in there?
Whoa. Is that really what it's like? It just stays the same. There's like a level.
Well, I once asked my elderly father and my elderly uncle, who were like 85 and 91, and how old they were inside. And my uncle said he was 7, and my father said he was about 20.
Whoa.
And then they explained how they got to that. And I thought, well, that makes sense. So that age is, let's say some days I wake up and I think, oh my God, I really am this old rickety person. And other days I'm just the same me in the capsule is aging, but not, not the internal being.
Maybe nothing ever happens to it. Do you think it just stays the same throughout, like,
No,
forever?
it changes. I mean, I look at I read some journals that I wrote when I was 20, and he's very immature.
Okay, so I'm
Okay.
streaming on Facebook here. We're gonna do. I'm just gonna punch in the title here.
I assume my sound level is fine.
Yeah, it sounds okay. I think my.
Okay.
What is this here? Go live.
Yeah. Well, your finger, your key tapping is very loud.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear it in the. I have my microphone sitting on the computer, so that might be an
That's
issue
okay.
here. But
Once we're on, you're not going to be doing a lot of. Yeah. Now this is, by the way, you're recording as well.
Yeah, so this is recording, and then it'll be streamed live to Facebook. And it started recording as soon as we came on, and it looks like
there's a couple of people who want to see it, and who I want to see it. There's
absolutely.
Other people.
Yeah, I can provide the recording. I think it comes in like a wave, or there'll be some file format that I can get to you. Okay, let me just make sure that we're on Facebook here. Yep. So we should be streaming. Cool. So welcome everybody. Thanks for showing up. We just went live on Facebook. We've been sitting here in the room for a little bit longer. We've got James Fadiman with us, Jim Fadiman. So what I'm going to do is I'll introduce Psychedelic Club. I'll introduce Jim Fadiman, and then we can get into the questions. So Psychedelic Club, for anybody who's not already aware of it, Psychedelic Club is a network of chapters who are dedicated to increasing mainstream acceptance of psychedelics. We are founded on the idea of cognitive liberty. We believe in a personal interest in psychedelics. We believe a personal interest in psychedelics is valid, healthy, and should be socially acceptable. We facilitate societal change and fight stigma on the grassroots level by organizing above ground, welcoming everybody, and sharing honestly. A red pen to the cultural narrative, public and non-exclusive. Psychedelic Club provides an accessible way to directly participate in the psychedelic renaissance. To find out more or get involved, you can go to psychedelicclub.com. It's Psychedelic Club with 1 C. So we're really, really excited to be chatting with Jim Fadiman today. Jim Fadiman is, I've got a little intro to him here. So after being introduced to psychedelics by his friend Ram Dass, then Richard Alpert in 1961, James, or Jim Fadiman, went on to become a luminary himself in the field. On top of informing an entire generation of psychonauts with his book, The Psychedelic Explorers Guide, Jim co-founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, now called Sofia University, served as director of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, the Sun Remission Project was a product of that. That's so fascinating. There's so much there. Jim has spent the last 10 years working on microdosing research and has contributed significantly to the world's understanding of personality with his newest book, Your Symphony of Selves. So I first became aware of you maybe 4 or 5 years ago through the Psychedelic Explorers Guide. And I read that, and just such an incredible primer to this field and to this information. So I'm so glad that you wrote it. Your expertise is sort of general, but I think it's, you know, a lot of general information, but you requested that we sort of constrain questions to microdosing, because that's a big part of your expertise. So this first question.
And if we go beyond that, that's fine. But I know that there's a lot of people who can answer general questions, and there are fewer people who can answer microdose questions. So we'll see. We'll do a batch of both. And also, I'm sure there'll be a few philosophic questions, which I'll answer as briefly as possible.
I was kind of hope you go in the other direction with the philosophical questions. I tend to like those, but
I know.
Okay, so this first question, we've got tons on microdosing. I'm really looking forward to getting into this. So this first question is from the Pittsburgh chapter of Psychedelic Club, and it goes: microdosing has been very helpful while I've been seeking treatment for PTSD. Unfortunately, with LSD, a tolerance was built in about 4 weeks of use. Approximately 6 months later, mushrooms were microdosed for about 5 months, with benefits appearing to last at least 5 months, then tapering off to no noticeable benefits. Is there a reason one substance may produce better effects in a person than another. How can one avoid building a tolerance when microdosing? I follow the protocols of taking the smallest possible subperceptual amounts on days 1, days 2, and days 3, then back on day 4. I would like to bring this back into my healing protocol, but I'm waiting to readjust tolerance. Thank you for what you do. Kind of a lot there.
That's just an awfully hard question. And I can't think of a question that I like less, because it's a very real question. It's a rare question. We all know that psychedelics have tolerance. You take psychedelics one day, you get very high. You take the same amount the next day, you get a little high. You take it the third day, and nothing. That's tolerance. With microdosing, it's deliberate, and this questioner did it exactly correctly, which is you take it on day 1. One of the protocols, you don't take it for 2 more days, and then you take it again. That's to protect you against tolerance. And in almost everyone, that works. Now, the other possibility is there is something else going on in your system for which, and that psychedelics don't seem to work for you now. That's really the basis of the question. It's doubtful that it's physiological, and we don't know much else, because first of all, very few people have the problem you have. And it may be that your system is simply saying the amount of growth or improvement or new neural networks is sufficient for a while, and that you need to digest, that your brain needs to be continuing on its rewiring, and the issues that led to the post-traumatic stress that you're talking about may need to be dealt with. Now, that may be all nonsense that I just said. And the answer may be you're very rare physiologically and I haven't the faintest idea. But that's the range. So since it's not working for you, you're on an enforced kind of furlough. And so you might as well use what you've learned about yourself and develop the habits that you've been developing. And let's hope that in a few months you can try it again and you can get the next boost up.
Okay, thanks for that. It seems like we have a lot of questions about tolerance, and so we may be coming back to this. I guess we started with your least favorite question, and it wasn't intentional.
Well,
but
it's very hard when someone says, basically, I did everything right and it didn't work. What's the problem? All right. The answer when you're in my side is, I wish I knew, because we do know a lot about different ways that people react to microdosing, but not reacting at all is very, very rare.
Interesting. So this next question is sort of in the same vein. It says, I have an unusually high tolerance. Up to 2 grams will typically give me near zero effects. I assume he's talking about psilocybin. How should I calculate a meaningful amount for microdosing? And this is from Winnemucca, Nevada.
Okay. When we were setting up our little research unit, and that's microdosingpsychedelics.com, and it's still a useful site. What we found is that there were some people who basically said, gee, 10 micrograms, which was a microdose, doesn't do anything for me. It takes at least 50. And my science collaborator, Sofia, said, you know, we're just not in that range. That isn't what we're studying. So we're just going to tell them you're not in that range. What we found is that people who have what they're calling high tolerance or are often also high functioning autistic, which is this Asperger's syndrome, and that they're super smart with and have some issues. They all report that they need more. And there is now finally a wonderful book called Autism on Acid. And it's somebody in this very smart range who describes so beautifully all the problems that people who are on the high functioning part of the continuum talk about. And what he did back and forth with acid, with high doses, with microdoses, with lots of other things, but in great detail. And I recommend it highly. And what he's done, by the way, just as an interesting thing, is you can buy his book on Amazon, or all the other ways you can get his book are free. And that's his contribution to what we're all doing. So that's the best I can tell you at this point, which is if for microdosing, you simply have to take what you consider a small dose And if you feel a little better and your day goes a little better, and you're not as depressed as you were, and you're nicer to people, that's the right dose. So it's a term that I like, which is how do you discover your sweet spot, which is what's the right dose for you, and it has to be personal, and it changes. Most people over time end up taking less microdosing per dose and less often. So it seems to achieve a certain level in you, and then you maintain that. It doesn't.
Wow, that's sort of amazing. I had no idea that there was like a mechanism like that in play. That it would be so personal. I mean, I think we're all looking. All the studies say this many milligrams per kilogram, and this, and everybody's sort of
Yeah,
looking
by the
for
way,
answers.
micrograms per kilogram. Finally, one of my wonderful friends, Albert, did a study where he looked at the studies that did kilogram, that did it measuring by body weight, which seems to be nonsense, and the other was measuring by what seems to be sensible, and there was no difference in the effects, in the value of the experiences. This was higher doses, and if you think about it. How much, let's say you look at yourself, how much do you weigh? 150, 180, 110, whatever it is. Now imagine you've gained 100 pounds. How much more has your brain gained? Probably an ounce. Okay. So why would the amount of psychedelics, which affects predominantly the brain and the intestinal system, have changed? So the kilograms, micrograms per kilogram is fine for mice. And even there, we're not sure.
Whoa. So it's much more deeply personal than studies imply. That's insane. We know nothing about this, do we? We're just like infants when it comes to this knowledge.
Well, no, I mean, when someone says to me, what's the correct dose of ice cream? That's obviously a silly question, because when you say to someone, how much ice cream would you like? They dose themselves depending on all the variables. Why should psychedelics be different? Because we know that there are doses. Some days you would like a dose that allows you to dive deeply into coding problems, and other days you want a dose to remind yourself that you're immortal and that you're part of everything. Those are obviously different uses, and they're different amounts of ice cream.
Wow. Thank you for that. Okay, so I'm going to skip the next question because it talks about tolerance again, and I feel like you've covered that. So this one is I sort of combined two questions, one from Anonymous and then one from Mind Tech Therapeutics is what they put in the. So it says, have any long-term effects, beneficial or harmful, been discovered from microdosing LSD or psilocybin? And then there's a specific question that says, do you believe that microdosing longer than a couple months can cause heart valvulopathy?
Okay, let's just take the heart valvular, because it's like this little dark meme that is pervading psychedelic research. Now listen, there's no evidence, zero. There are 26 to 30 million people that have taken LSD since it became illegal. Number of heart patients with that rare condition, as far as we know, none. There was a different substance that was taken at a dose approximately 1,000 times more than a microdose over daily for some months. That product, which was a weight loss product, was taken off the market because it had a side effect of these heart problems. It has nothing to do with it. But there is one major researcher that keeps throwing it in as if it's real. Now, we of course could do research. We could take, say, 100,000 people and have them microdose for 25 years, and then have another 100,000 people that didn't microdose for 25 years. We could compare the level of that particular condition, because it's rare enough that you'd need that large a sample, but we're never going to do that. So psychedelics have to be used carefully and sanely. Microdosing has to be used not as carefully, but still sanely. And the notion that it has a physiological effect on a rare heart condition, it's kind of an embarrassment to have it out there, because the person who pushes it is a wonderful human being and a magnificent scientist. But also in a newspaper interview once, he was quoted as saying, well, I don't like microdoses, which is kind of like, I don't like this flavor of ice cream. I don't get it.
Sounds a little bit biased, maybe more than a little bit biased.
Maybe.
Yeah, that one came up. Somebody was telling me that Shulgin had a heart valve issue, and they were speculating, well, it must have been all those tryptamines that he did, that because that book that he wrote about, it must be that. What else could it be? And there's just this sort of jump. So that's great to hear. There's no evidence.
He also aged. That could have been due to psychedelics.
I don't know. So there's a question from Philip that just came up in the chat that I do actually want to ask. So it says, can we get James's opinion on the Imperial paper recently published regarding microdosing as no more effective than placebo?
No, I don't want to do that. Is that the microdosing paper that says it's all a placebo?
Yes.
Oh, that poor researcher. Right? The internal analyses are actually pretty good. And I don't recommend, but I would urge you or force you to read the whole paper and then wonder why the conclusions don't match the data. Now, there's some other problems. They're very simple. One is his sample was healthy people, meaning you can't improve your scores, say, on depression if you're not depressed. You don't have much room to go. If you're very depressed, you can obviously improve a lot. So he picked people that had almost no mental issues, and he didn't measure any physical issues. He also picked people who were already microdosing or had already microdosed. Now, for those of you who have microdosed, what you've noticed is there were some improvements probably in your life where you wouldn't be listening to this program. But they level off, okay? So he's picked people with the least possible chance of improvement. And then his protocol is taking it less often than any other protocol of any study, on or off, legal or not. So it looks like almost a setup to find as a conclusion that not much happened. Now, the other thing is, this is according to one of the Canadian researchers, the statistics he used, Bayesian statistics, don't allow you to say when you have basically no result, that the no result proves anything. All you're allowed to say is we had no result. So there's a lot of structural problems with the paper, and there are a lot of detailed ones. And a lot of people have been hammering on him very unkindly. If you go to Reddit, Reddit has a microdosing subreddit. It has 130,000 people on it. And he did Ask Me Anything. And what basically people said is, hey, most of us on this 130,000 people found personally that we had changes due to microdosing. So it doesn't make sense to us that you couldn't find any. Can you explain? And some of them gave, detailed scientific questions, and others just said, what's going on, man? So I would say this is a minor study. It got a lot of media for about 3 days. It's unfortunate because he came up with a fairly clever idea for a single blind. And according to him, 72% of the guesses of what people were taking were accurate, which those of you whose statistics are a little weak, if you're guessing between two things, 50% is called chance. 72% is that most people, or most of the time, people broke the blind. So, and what he says is people said they benefited. And we know there is something called a placebo effect, which is if you want something to happen, if you are told it's good, you're more likely to think it's good. If someone says, hey, go to this restaurant, you'll love it, particularly the Szechuan chicken, you're already primed to like the chicken. That happens to be human behavior. So when you're taking a microdose, when you've already been microdosing, and you have a positive point of view, and he points out, that most people obviously in the study, liked microdosing. So there's a lot of variables that basically get in the way of his conclusions. And so one wonders what happened between the data and the write-up. Now, he did all the work, and there's about 9 writers. And so one of the things I would be interested in is looking at drafts of the paper and see where this shift from his genuine reporting and his somewhat puzzling conclusions. But if any of you feel after reading it that your microdosing deceived you, then you should stop.
That's very strange that 70% of people should be able to accurately break the blind and guess correctly that they had taken a microdose. But
yeah, well, one of the problems in almost all psychedelic research is if you're doing a single or a double blind is how fast people get it. That, when you're in one of the high dose studies, imagine you're in a high dose study and you lie down and you put on the headphones and you lie back, and after about 30 minutes or an hour, you think, oh, I'm the control today, or this is the placebo. And you say, did I get the placebo? And the other people in the room can't tell you, but they've got to go through the whole boring day with you as if you're on a psychedelic. I find it, I have compassion, not for the person who's got the placebo, but for all that staff who have to sit there and pretend they don't know you broke it.
Oh man, that's that I had never considered that before. The placebo from the perspective of the facilitator. It's like, okay, man, we're just gonna sit here for the next 6 hours and hang out. Art says somebody in the chat, I have never felt deceived by a microdose. Okay, next one is from Anonymous. It says, I guess it's another sort of pattern question. It says Stamets recommends 5 days on, 2 days off, but you've recommended 1 day on, 2 days off. These are obviously very different. How does one determine what to do?
Let's see. I'm trying to think of an image that isn't about sexual positions, but it's hard, which is, I have to kind of admit to this very wise and learned crowd across the country that the so-called Fadiman protocol was never designed for clinical use, mainly because I hadn't the faintest idea whether microdoses had any value when I developed it. What I did get is that many people have a second day effect. It's a little bit like the afterglow from a high dose. And a lot of people have written me and said, wow, the second day is even better, okay? Now, what was the purpose then of that 3rd day off? Well, the 3rd day off for me was so you would come down to baseline so that when you took it another time, you would have some experience that you could then make a note about and send to me so I could learn something. And the reason that the protocol is for 30 days is that's enough data. And most people won't do things more than that anyway, won't write you notes or fill in forms or do anything. And at the end of 30 days, what we say on that microdosing psychedelic site is you now know your own body by then. It's been up and down, and you should do whatever you choose works for you. Now, so mine was a research protocol. The Microdose Institute in Holland, which has a couple of, well over 1,000 people that they have worked with microdosing and coaching, and we'll perhaps talk about that. They have an every other day, except when that's not appropriate. Then it's either sometimes they start even more often than that for a while and then go to a different protocol and a different protocol. Stamets protocol is 4 or 5 days on and 2 or 3 days off. And I once asked Paul, I said, a lot of people ask me, is a Stamets protocol 4 days or 5 days? And Paul said, well, you got to be flexible. Okay, so what we know is your body is the only instrument that matters. So the protocol that works best for you is the one that you should use. I know that that's not exactly answering the kind of can we fit it into the box question, but psychedelics are kind of, a little flexible that way.
Maybe a necessarily out of the box type of thing. That's such a wonderful thing. There's so much freedom in that. There's so much freedom to experiment and figure it out for yourself. That just seems.
Well, also it says you are responsible for your own mind and for what you put in it. Shulgin has a comment that says, when you look at a chemical, it's your job to understand it as much as possible before you take it. That's your responsibility. The chemical doesn't have any responsibility, which is why he tested everything on himself. And if he didn't, if it wasn't terrible, he would then test it on a bunch of trusted friends who tried a lot of other substances, and then he'd write it up. And if you read his write-ups about all these substances that nobody else has ever tried, the little write-ups are about what the group experienced, so that we have some ideas before you get into it. Now, by now with microdosing, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of experiences, so we have some pretty good ideas for people with special issues or special concerns.
That's so there's nobody to blame but ourselves for either the credit or for the positive or the negative. Freedom is in the responsibility, and freedom in the same go. Okay, this is another one from Anonymous. Does macrodosing during the traditional 10-week program significantly affect outcome of microdosing? And then it says, if so, it's another tolerance question. If so, is this a tolerance related matter? I think
what is generally agreed upon in like the Reddit crowd who try everything, and it's like the Irwin crowd. Most people feel if you're going to macrodose, take time off from microdosing, let your system clear, and don't go back to microdosing for quite a while, because if you've macrodosed, you have a lot to integrate, even if you don't think you do. You still have, your system has a lot to integrate. And in the 60s, we did a little research project where we simply gave people a very standard personality test that's not supposed to change. Those are the instruments we liked. We found that people's personalities were changing up to 9 months after a single dose. So that integration is more than you think. And the only issue I have is when people say, well, I macrodose once a month. And I think, well, that's kind of like eating a huge meal every night, which is the system, if it digests, you get the maximum nourishment. And so what I've found, and you'll see it if you read Ram Dass's memoir, Being Ram Dass, which is remarkable, you'll see that he used psychedelics incredibly often, and more found that it didn't have much benefit. Which is why he eventually gave up psychedelics.
That's that whole, if you get the message, hang up the phone quote, the one that people love to. Do you feel like there's a regular macrodosing protocol?
Not that I know of. That's kind of, how often should you go to Paris?
It's such a beautiful place. You don't just want to live there, you don't want to leave.
Right. Well, I lived in Paris for a year, which is why I can say that. So, no, I think, again, I'm actually some kind of right-wing conservative on how often should you macrodose. And my question is, how much benefit are you establishing yourself willing to get? And if you're really going to, remember in lots of studies, and all of number of you who are listening, is one session made a big change in your life. And what we found, again, decades ago, is that very few people who had a full high dose preparation, good, support, music, etc., and integration necessarily wanted another. They really did hang up the phone. So the notion of, well, I need it once a month, man, because I want to check out and see if the universe is still, if I'm still the universe, that begins to diminish its value.
You mentioned the 9 month changes in personality changes persisting for 9 months. Was that conscientiousness? Was that the one metric that was changing, or what personality
No,
scale?
this was a personality test called the Minnesota Multiphasic MMPI. I don't remember what the eyes
I
were.
think it's the Minnesota Multiphagic Personality Inventory.
Yeah, and it may still be around, and it's very stable. And what we wanted is instruments that psychology said are really stable, because we thought people were changing at a very deep level, and they were changing at the level of structure, and that's what we found.
Huh. Wow.
So that kind of research really hasn't been repeated, partly because those kinds of instruments go out of fashion, and second of all, when you're most of the macro research is very, very limited. Smoking, depression, the dying, okay? And the follow-ups usually are only mainly about that particular topic. So if you look at, say, the first smoking study, 12 people, to get into the study, you had to have been a 20-year smoker, a couple of packs a day, and you tried like 3 or 4 or 5 different ways to stop smoking. So you were hardcore, resistant to anything. And on the first study, after 1 month, 11 of the 12 smokers had not smoked anything. Now, and after about 6 months, I think that was still true. They didn't ask all the other interesting questions that must have happened to get them to that place. Now, by the way, microdosing, we also have a number of people who said, I microdosed and stopped smoking. So one doesn't necessarily need to be hit over the head with a 2x4 in order to get the message.
I had not heard about microdosing for addiction, but it's really sort of synchronistic because somebody, as you answered that question, somebody had posted it in the chat about microdosing for addiction. So that was
yeah. Well, the nice thing is when people say, "Well, should I microdose for this or that?" I say, "Why don't you try it once? Try and see how it works for you." What we know, for example, is macrodosing is terrific for depression for about 6 to 8 weeks or maybe a couple of months. What is less well known is that microdosing has about an 80% success rate for depression, and it's a lot cheaper and easier than going to being in one of the few studies you can get into. So our data is it's about 80% effective, and what we get is people after 1 or 2 microdoses are writing us and saying, "I'm back. I'm myself again." So we're really looking at something quite extraordinary that has not yet been well reported. Where it is, by the way, being looked at is a lot of these new created in 25 days or less companies that are going to revolutionize psychedelics forever for the world. They seem to notice that depression and microdosing might be one of the ways towards their economic success.
There's so many different routes to go. I see so many different paths from the question that you just that you just answered. Those little 25-day companies, it really seems like the commercialization of the sacred or the commodification of the sacred. That's a whole nother thing, maybe. And maybe
there are 2 issues. One is the commercialization of the sacred, and if you've ever been to a mega church, you know what commercialization of the sacred is. But also, the medicalization of the sacred is a very different topic. And there's a growing concern that with all of the money and excitement pouring into medical uses only of psychedelics, that we are going to make it harder for spiritual use.
That's a really rough, really tricky position. A lot of people have been talking about that lately. It's one that I get concerned about. It's like, well, these things don't just belong to practitioners necessarily; they belong to humans.
There's a recent post by David Bronner, who has been supporting both MAPS and Oregon's decriminalization and use of psilocybin for therapeutic purposes. And it turns out that Compass, one of the very big companies, or big companies as a stock, they're not, they're not big, has taken a position that says, we think that psychedelics should be approved of by physicians, not voters. So they're actually coming out somehow trying to not supporting Oregon. And that's a very curious thing for a company to do.
I guess it's just money driven, right? I mean, it seems like it's upsetting. So that's an upsetting thing to hear that Compass might be actively preventing initiatives like Oregon and the people from having
No,
access.
that they're not supportive. Let's say they didn't prevent it, obviously, but it is an interesting thing that companies have some. It's valuable for a company, obviously, to own a piece of the turf. Okay. Now, one of the problems when you own a piece of the psychedelic turf is there's usually been a whole lot of people sitting on that turf till you came along. So it's very hard to demonstrate in a way that makes sense that you're doing something sufficiently novel that it's different from what everyone else has already been doing.
Yeah, it feels like everyone's trying to just to pick up the old thing, say this is mine. It's been laying on the ground forever. I guess this is sort of a strange question, this next one, but I want to ask it. It's a little bit related to what we've just been talking about. It's from Anonymous again, and it goes, someone recently made the argument in casual conversation that if you were to argue that the COVID vaccine was potentially unsafe because of a lack of long-term clinical trials, you could also argue that psychedelics were unsafe because clinical trials were halted in the late 70s. What would you say to that? It was tough to respond to since many psychedelics are natural and have been used for a long time by native groups with little to no ill effect.
I'm gonna kind of tear the veil off of your eyes. Long-term clinical trial. Now, that sounds like one of those wonderful trials where they go on for 20 years. I happen to have read a wonderful book called The Emperor's New Drugs.
Irving Kirsch.
Questions, it's a wonderful book about questioning the nature of what pharmacology companies actually do. And it's about mainly antidepressants. And it makes a very strong case that antidepressants actually are they are better than placebos, but by such a small amount that human beings can't notice. That's one of the positions of the book. And it's a very useful book if you want to understand research. But one of the questions is, given that SSRIs have been around for 20 years, how about the long-term clinical studies? Well, it turns out the companies that make SSRIs do 6-month follow-ups. Rarely anything more. So something which you're being prescribed for the rest of your life has never had a long-term clinical study. Psychedelics have for many people, I guess I'm probably one of them, we can ask for long-term effects because people have been using them for a long time. So we can get citizen science long-term studies pretty quickly whenever we're interested. And most people will, the only bits of data we have, and it's kind of big conglomerate data, is that people who've used psychedelics seem to be saner and healthier than the general population. But that may also be due that they're probably have higher education, probably therefore have slightly higher income, and we know have better health simply because of income. But we do know that data exists. But as you see, it doesn't answer much.
Sure. It's so funny that you should mention Irving Kirsch and The Emperor's New Drug. That's one of the most, it's infuriating almost, because I mean, there's so many people on SSRIs, and he makes the argument, the meta-analyses, the studies of studies in that book. He's like, look, the FDA only requires 3 efficacious studies before they approve a drug. They don't count how many you do. So pharmaceutical companies are brute forcing studies through the FDA. And it's like, what?
Okay, so Clayton and I have read it, and we both were infuriated when we read it. But I can imagine if you've been on SSRIs for a while and you read this book, except that you've been slightly numbed by the SSRIs, you're going to be upset as well. But For those of you who want to take it seriously, The Emperor's New Drugs. It's in print, it's around, and it's a you will never look at either SSRIs or research on pharmaceuticals the same way, and that's of course the value of any good book.
It's an amazing book and another almost infinitely long hallway that we're just gonna have to walk past in this moment. But, okay, so the next question again from anonymous. We had a lot of anonymous
Oh,
questions.
anonymous, you've got a lot to say.
I know it's they always have so much to say.
Yes.
So this one, it seems like it would have been amazing to have been so close to the psychedelic beginning and studies in the 60s and 70s. I almost wish I was born in another decade. This decade's pretty good too. What has that experience been like? And what has it been like to see the drugs become illegal, move underground, and then slowly back into the light now?
Well, a lot of people have said to me, "Aren't you glad you lived long enough to see, the curve turn and psychedelics become not only accepted but cool, even past cool to kind of conventional." And none of us, of course, ever thought there would be a mad rush to make lots of money off of cutting off little bites of the psychedelic apple. That never occurred to us. Um, Growing up in the 60s actually was the last time when almost everyone looked to the future with hope. Now we look to the future as, can we stave off disaster? That's a very different world. So in terms of psychedelics, no, it was not at all fun to be basically to be hounded by the culture, arrested by the officials, prevented from doing either research, arrested for personal work, and really being unable to get your parents to understand why you had made all these changes and that you didn't want to be a banker anymore. So that was the dark side. The light side, this was a time when the ecology movement was starting, the women's movement was starting, social justice was starting. Understanding and appreciating the natural world was being returned. So it was a wonderful time of hope. And the feeling was that if we just could move forward, because we were nice people and we felt that everyone else was either genuinely nice or secretly nice, that the world could become a better place. And I was looking at a quote the other day, and it said it was a time when the world tipped towards the light, but the light didn't stay long enough.
Is there reason to hope now?
Yeah, you know. Well, there's been for many of us, there's been 4 years of being always slightly depressed because you never knew what the government was going to do to harm something else that you valued. That's hard. We're now in a position where the government is trying to unwind some of those dark places, that we're actually back on track for climate change. We're making progress in a lot of areas, and it's cheering. Now, we've also come through this terrible, at least in the United States, the incredible death toll from bad government. So we're coming out of that as well. And there is a feeling, now I'm elderly enough, so I've been vaccinated. And there's a feeling of relief that I'm in less danger of dying randomly than was true before. So this is a time of hope. The question is it going to be a time of hopeful action or just hope? The 60s, after all, were full of action. People did stuff. Earth Day was the idea of someone that said, why don't we celebrate the Earth? Now it's it's an international event. Things like that.
That's I'm really glad to hear that. This isn't a question that's on the list, but I'm wondering, on the topic of action, if there's action that you see that could be taken that's not being taken, if there's opportunity for action that's not already being capitalized on.
Well, it's easy to ask other people to be activists. In a sense, this Psychedelic Club is an amazing event. And that the more chapters, the more knowledge, and also that you know there are other people that both share your interests and you can ask questions. There's a wonderful grad student list that some of you undoubtedly are on that started, I helped start it with MAPS. And it has well over 1,000 people from a dozen different disciplines in maybe 30 countries. And they just help each other. Now they're starting because they're starting to have little conferences of their own, or if you're interested in social justice and psychedelics, or if you're interested in why are there so few blacks in psychedelics, or if we want to protect indigenous use, these are kind of subgroups forming out of this graduate student group. All of that is active. And again, people are feeling empowered, partly because they're not alone. Oh, and I also want to send a particular shout out to one of your members in Milwaukee, who wrote me a note recently about how he had overcome a lifelong problem. And I'm just so happy and moved by what he shared, and he's quite elderly. And that people are still turning their lives around in serious ways with the use of psychedelics. And it's a time when it's hard not to be active, and just telling other people without any embarrassment is active.
Just being open and honest, sharing openly and honestly. That's one of the, ideally, Psychedelic Club dissolves itself. I'd like to see no need for Psychedelic Club. It's like, well, it's silly to organize under the name Psychedelic Club because it's just a part of the culture. But yeah, thank you for those words and for reaching out to.
There isn't a Rose Club.
Right. You don't need it.
But there are lots of people who get together and try and make better roses.
Exactly.
By the way, it's a wonderful little Reddit group. The various gardening groups on Reddit are just so full of people asking questions, and shall I add a little more potassium to my fertilizer? And then you get 25 answers. It's really community at its nicest. I find the Reddit groups one of the most supportive groups I've found.
You are a Redditor.
Well, I'm on it. I'm 130,000.
Okay, so this next question is actually this one's for me. So it says, your book, The Psychedelic Explorers Guide, does an incredible job of busting several common psychedelic myths, like the one that says LSD stays in your spine. 10 years after publication, have you seen that these myths have been made less common, or are they still deeply entrenched? Or are there still deeply entrenched myths that you see commonly spewed? Or
well, when let's say that misinformation usually doesn't last more than a generation. And I think I'm going back, and I think this was before I wrote the book. And I live near Stanford University, and I got a PhD doing psychedelic research at Stanford. Don't worry, it never happened again. And some student said, I am on a project and I'm supposed to do something about science, and I wanted to ask you about psychedelic research. And I thought, that's cool. And she said, is it true that if you take LSD 7 times that you go insane? And I couldn't quite handle it at first. One tries to be, professional old professor. But I thought, what the f is going on? What is out there in the culture? And there was stuff like that. And one of the reasons I then, in the Psychedelic Explorers Guide, have a chapter just on myth busting, is because it was necessary. Just like with the new myth is the heart stuff, or the myth of the placebo. These are the myths we're creating now. And it's very hard in the social media world to get rid of a myth. As we saw, with the conspiracy theories that the President Trump would rise again and arrest all the pedophiles and triumph and enter into the kingdom of heaven all over again. Very hard to get that out of the psyche of the people who are into it. So again, truth doesn't it doesn't move as quickly in social media as lies, and actually there's a lot of research about that. But eventually, truth is usually what's left after people check it out.
More reasons to be hopeful, I suppose. There's a question in the chat that is not on our list, but I do want to ask it from Tasha. She says, "I'm African, Native American. How do I get more people of color involved?"
Whew. Well, I was into the white guilt of how come psychedelics is so white until I spent some time with a Black activist. And he was saying that in the Black community, psychedelics have a bad name. And there's a lot of negative talk about psychedelics in the Black community, including that that they're the tool of the devil. And that aside from that, they seem to be something that white people like, which is maybe already not a good idea for Blacks. And so my question to her is, what can we do to help her educate the Black community into healthy use? And again, the reason I like microdosing is it doesn't threaten anybody. You know, when you microdose, and I should make this very, very clear, the definition of microdosing is no psychedelic effects. Let me make that clear, okay? A lot of people say, well, gee, I don't know, I like tripping, but when I microdose, like nothing happens, man. And I think, well, that's it, you got the right dose. And early on, I got a wonderful email from someone telling me that I was full of it, it was nonsense, and he tried it, and nothing ever happened. And then I wrote him back and I said, that's too bad, it isn't for everybody, you know, kind of nice. And then he wrote me back, he said, you know, however, at the end of the day, I looked at the work I'd done and that I'd solved several problems, I'd created a new project, and it had been an absolutely wonderfully useful day. And I wrote him back, I said, that's what's called microdosing. Okay. So the thing to keep in mind, microdosing is not a little baby trip. Okay. It's as if you're on the AM dial and the FM dial, they're different. And one of the problems for microdosing is they happen to be made of psychedelics. Had they been made of, you know, some arcane form of chocolate, they'd be in every pharmacy in the country right now.
Thank you for that. Jim. And yeah, to Tasha, I mean,
Yes, Tasha. So what can we do, and what can the Psychedelic Club do to help you talk to people who won't listen to us?
Yeah, we're happy to support whoever wants to step up, to start chapters and to organize and to walk this path in this way. Okay, so we've got next question is from the Psychedelic Club of Iowa. This is sort of an interesting one. So do you have any information regarding the use of any specific technology, cognitive exercises, or other practices that could be, or maybe have already been, used in conjunction with psychedelics that have shown to maximize their beneficial effects? I'm trying to find proven or promising techniques, puzzles, apps, and exercises that can be utilized to get the most out of the enhanced neuroplasticity and neurogenesis promoted by these compounds. Yeah. Thanks for all your work.
Let's go back a step. Neuroplasticity is really this wonderful term, which is your brain can get better cells when it makes new neurons. And that literally psychedelics, I think high dose, in a sense, lays down armatures in which the new cells can form. Microdosing seems to simply improve neuroplasticity as it goes along. Neuroplasticity meaning better brain, okay? And we have some fascinating reports of people with advanced dementia and with Alzheimer's who during a microdose show a remarkable amount of cognitive capacity that they haven't shown for months. Okay, not saying we're turning around any of those conditions because we don't have that data at all, but that there's a lot more residual plasticity or residual mental capacity in people who we have kind of dismissed as they're too far gone. So the question of what improves neuroplasticity, and what I love in the kind of Alzheimer dementia literature is, first of all, it's all physical and we're working on the chemicals. And by the way, the best way to not have it is crossword puzzles, travel, learning a new language. Those of you who have ever talked to anyone who works out, if you gotta, if you don't use it, you lose it. So it turns out that keeping your brain going seems to be the only thing we know that seems to hold off neurodegenerative diseases. And what we know about microdosing is they seem to improve the functioning of the whole system, this whole system. So that we have all these amazing little stories about microdosing improving very curious conditions. But if we step back and say, well, what if this was a vitamin? And what we know about a vitamin is it's supposed to help the whole body. There's a very puzzling, not puzzling, it's kind of the way science is, which is if you can measure it, you're a winner, okay? So if we've all seen the pictures of the brain, and what we know for sure is that if you give a psychedelic, you get more colored lines in the brain. That's because I've seen it in dozens of papers. And then they talk about the neuron, and it's a 5-2A, and that the neuron likes LSD and it grabs it, and that's why it takes so long. These are wonderful things, no data, but wonderful notions. And I then say to some of the neuroscientists, are there more neurons in your brain or in your gut? And there's this moment of silence because they know there's more neurons in your gut. Now, if I take a psychedelic, a little tab on the tongue, we've all seen the pictures. Does it go from my tongue to my brain? No, it goes from my tongue into my blood system, and it goes to every cell in the body. So the question that's of interest is, how do psychedelics work in the body where they are difficult to measure? But just because it's difficult to measure doesn't mean you then ignore it. Okay? And we're going to find out, there's going to be a lot of news in psychiatry in the next 15 years that a lot of mental illness is your biome, is the bacteria and viruses that are working out their destiny in your belly. And that there are thousands of species eating each other, having sex, thinking about the whole sphere of bacteria and viruses working it out. And that it turns out that a lot of mental illness may simply be a shift in the ratios of various families of bacteria.
You get into that.
By the way, if this wasn't true in 20, you can say he didn't get it right. If I did get it right, then I get a little gold star in whatever post-life place I'm at.
Jim, you already have all the gold stars from us. You get into this in a really fascinating way in your Symphony of Selves, which I do want to get to. We've just got a couple more questions in this vein before maybe we jump a little bit. Oh, it says my connection is unstable. Just let me know. I'm thinking it's still working, but hopefully this continues. Okay, so this one is from the Psychedelic Club of Fort Collins, Colorado. In the spirit of Aldous Huxley's quote about the mind being a valve, which limits incoming data so that we're not overwhelmed by its vast depths and details, and how psychedelics tend to loosen that valve and let more in. I'd like to hear your views on this, on how especially microdosing on a regular basis can widen the scope of perspective, experience, apprehension of reality, whatever that is. Will a much smaller amount more gradually introduce us to the wider version of, it's a long question. Let's see. Yeah. What are your experiences with this? Yeah.
What Huxley's talking about is you handles, I think it's maybe 11 million bits a second. The conscious mind can handle about 6. Okay. So, consciously, we just get a little teeny bit of what's going on. And if you think about it, almost all of your brain is working full time running this very complicated system, right? If I do this, hundreds of thousands of cells are being, fussed with. And there's something in my brain doing it, and I'm sending controls, and there's lots of feedback loop. It's very complicated, okay? That's what it's doing most of the time. And if I eat, oh my God, how complicated it is, all right? Let alone that it also reacts to internally generated imagery as if it were external. So if I'm thinking about a particular person and I find myself being turned on, what has happened? Okay, the other person is totally unaware that anything has ever happened, right? There may be they may be in the other side of the world. But my mental imagery works on my physiology and it gets complicated, okay? I'm not sure I didn't lose the question with all that complication. But the fact is, the idea of a reducing valve is a great image, because one of the things you notice with a high dose in particular, because it's screamingly obvious, that you're in touch with the, it's all energy, and is actually a bunch of atoms, and that they're all moving, that each, if we go into one, it's energy. So, and why, if this is just energy, why can't I put my hand through the desk? Is because there's something about the density of matter. But if you know physics well enough, still just energy. Okay, so what Huxley was saying is you get more open to how much is going on. And there is a feeling, and it's almost like going through a doorway, where you begin to be overwhelmed with the amount of data coming in. And some people get very frightened at that point, because past that point, their personal identity is not the defining characteristic that they're aware of. They transcend their personality. There's a psychology personal beyond the personal. And psychedelics are a prototype of how to have that experience. Now, microdosing is a different situation. Microdosing is a little bit like going to the gym, which is if you go to the gym and you lift 30 pounds and the next week you lift 32 pounds, and then you do another set of reps that you couldn't do before, and very gradually you improve whatever part of the system you're working on. Microdosing for people that don't have an illness or a condition seems like that, which is you're not, say you're doing technical problems wildly hard, but you're at your best. Keep being at your best, your best gets better. Now, as I said, with depression and things, a lot of other conditions, the shift is faster, because it looks like a lot of conditions, physical conditions, say migraines, a mismatch in the system, the equilibrium in the system are off kilter. And that if you can get them back into equilibrium, the symptoms go away. We have a number of data points, for instance, on women who have difficult periods. Difficult meaning painful or emotionally upsetting. And what we found with microdosing is they report that they normalize, that their periods are, as they're supposed to be, normal, healthy shifts of a lot of hormones in the female body over a period of days, and that's it. So how does that shift happen? Well, it isn't that the instead of going to your brain, which we know already is silly, it just goes to your sexual, we also know is silly. It obviously improves the body's capacity to run itself correctly, because it goes to every cell. And I have to give you one number, because I can't handle this number, but it's because it's very big. But it suggests why psychedelics might not just sit in your brain. Permission from the federal government to synthesize, and I said, how many molecules are there in 1/10 of a gram of LSD? Okay, right, everybody take your pencils and write down your guess. Okay, 1.54 quadrillion.
Quadrillion?
Quadrillion.
Quadrillion.
Quadrillion. Now, originally, Nick sent me whatever the next one is, synctillion. And he said, oh no, that was an error, only quadrillion. Okay? Then you run that against how many cells in your body, and you'll see there's more than enough molecules so that every cell in your body can have some. And there's enough left over to have a lot more in your brain.
Whoa.
Now, I don't know how to deal with that, okay? that doesn't, that's like, how many stars are there? Well, as many as there are grains of sand on the beach. Well, okay. I mean, 1, 2, 3, and then I have to take off my shoes, and it's a lot.
So, but it's
okay.
It's a systemic sort of medicine. A systemic thing is systems like throughout the whole organism. I think maybe.
Well, it has to be.
Huh.
I mean, when you take anything into your system, it goes everywhere. There are parts of the body.
Huh. It's an amazing way to think about it. I feel like we're breaking up a little bit. I don't know. I keep getting a message that says the connection is unstable. Oh, it's been working. Okay, maybe it must be. It's just me. I'm just way out here.
No, it's connection is unstable. I'm into Star Wars, so if the connection's unstable, there's aliens in the system.
I hope so. I hope the aliens are here. All right. So this one is from Philadelphia. It says, I found microdosing to be like scraping away the tartar that is accumulated on your personality as you go through life. The tartar was built up to protect you from being hurt by things. Without that tartar, things can feel a bit raw. How do we live without the protective tartar?
Well, one of the nice things about growing up is that your childhood will never come back. It's this wonderful feeling that it kind of disturbs psychotherapists when I say, you're not going to change your childhood, no matter how often you go to therapy. And so what happens is, as an adult, and what psychedelics help you do, is look back at the tartar-causing events. And the first thing you get is they're over. And the second thing is that your being is bigger than the event. And then, again, I've been reading Ram Dass, who's heavy on reincarnation, with the notion that whatever happened in this lifetime is an opportunity to clean up stuff that happened in other lifetimes. Or it's a chance to get more tartar, so you're going to have it hard in the next lifetime. Now, that isn't quite the way I think of things, but I don't want to turn away from 4,000 to 5,000 years of Hindu thoughtful reflection on what life is like. So we don't know. And the nice thing about microdosing is, and I love the tartar image, because, every 6 months or 4 months, you go to the dentist and he takes off the tartar, because in the tartar, there's nothing bad about tartar, but in the tartar, there's bacteria that like to eat teeth. So that when you take the tartar off, and you leave the dentist, in a sense, your teeth are not raw, but they're at a maximum healthy space. And the nice thing about microdosing is it happens fairly slowly. And again, if it exposes things that are disturbing, say traumatic incidents, etc., that's why we are recommending more and more coaching. That microdosing plus coaching looks like an ideal method, because it allows you to get the maximum benefit from the microdose. And again, there's Flow State Micro, for example, that just coaches people. And the Netherlands Institute does coaching. And I'm just learning how, while I tend to think that microdosing is something you do and, life goes on, it turns out, like most things that matter, if you pay much more attention and you get help where you get stuck, obviously you do better. I mean, I like the term coaching, because coaching is only when you need it. Therapy is whenever it's scheduled. That's very different.
That's the coaching and microdose model. So the tartar is not protective. It is
protective, but it doesn't work well.
It's protecting. It's eating away the teeth. Well,
yeah.
Huh. All
So
right.
it's a great image.
Yeah, that's I hadn't considered the teeth, but it's just such a beautiful and sort of horrific image. uh, okay, so this next question, this is for me. In your Symphony of Selves, you mentioned that microdosing can be used to consciously shift into a more useful or appropriate self. Your Symphony of Selves, it's one of the most profoundly impactful books that I've probably ever read in my life. It just as a tool for working with these states and as a tool for working with these experiences, I can't talk enough about how positively it's impacted me and helped me make sense of things. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your Symphony of Selves,
Yeah,
and the
yeah.
connection between psychedelics and a healthy selves model.
Well, your Symphony of Selves, discover and learn more of who you really are, which is that it turns out, thank you, actually who you are, not who you really are, because you are who you really are. It turns out that the single self model, that you're a single consistent self, has no evidence. That you are inconsistent has a lot of evidence. And that you actually have separate selves within you, or separate parts, or self states. One page of the book actually has 70 different terms we found, because it's people are trying to understand why they're inconsistent. And what they find is that they are working to harmonize their different selves. And that's what we're talking about as a symphony. Now, first of all, let me just give you a simple example. In case some of you are saying, oh, Fadiman was okay on psychedelics, but now he's some kind of nutcase. Okay. All right.
What a weird turn of events.
Called a lot worse. That's with psychedelics. Have you ever argued with yourself? Okay. Now, I know the answer, by the way, is yes. Okay. You don't have to go to the back of the book. Have you ever argued with yourself? Okay. Who's the other person arguing? Well, it's me. Well, but I'm over here arguing. Have you ever changed sides during an internal argument? Have you ever talked to yourself? It turns out, by the way, that people who talk to themselves in the third person, like Jim, you got to remember you're going to be doing this show with Clayton. You got to make sure that you plan your day so you drive home in time. It turns out that people who talk to themselves in the third person are more effective and are mentally more stable and healthy than people who don't. That's just psychology. And the book has, by the way, about 1,000 examples, from Beyonce to religious examples, neuroscience examples, philosophy examples. Psychology, early psychology, totally understood the nature of selves. In fact, one associated with oneself, and if one was mentally ill, one disassociated, for which we get the term disassociation. So that's the background, okay? Now, what does this have to do with psychedelics? Well, one of the things that happens, particularly with a high dose, is when you come back, you're kind of puzzled. One is, who are you? Why did you come back to this person being this body? And you have now found probably some parts of yourselves that you didn't understand or know. So integration is getting yourselves a little better into more harmony. That's your goal. Now, we have a term for mental health called being in the right mind at the right time. So right now, I'm in my speak carefully, try to go for complete sentences, don't say or you know, and come up with images that are perhaps more vivid than I would normally do if I was writing. So it's a very tight focus. Now, in my house, which is about 30 feet away, I have two very small dogs. And when I'm done with this, they're going to come at me with a combination of where were you and I'm really glad you're back. Okay. I am not going to say to them, there are two ways that you dogs can understand this, because my spatial, disorientation from you was actually beneficial for our long-term stability as a family. I don't do that. I say, hey, Adam, hello, Timmy. Come on. Hey. I shift into being able to play with little dogs. And when one of them licks my ear, I know the difference between having a dog lick your ear and other things lick your ear. You know, I don't lose capacity, but I shift into a different self. That shift is normal, that shift is healthy, that shift is sane. Okay. At the moment, not at the moment, but the last couple of days, I've been doing my taxes. Now, I'm not good at that. And it brings up the truth that I keep very poor records. And the IRS doesn't see that as an excuse. So I have these stacks of paper, and I know I have to shift into the self that won't either berate me or not want to do it because I need to do it. And therefore, if I shift into that, I can do a few hours of taxes. And then my other selves say, I really don't like this. Can we do something else? Almost anything else. Okay. So that's the shift. And here's another shift is if you, we actually were trained as children to shift. And here's one that almost all of you know. Or, oh, you're upset. Count to 10. And as a child, you think, why the hell should I count to 10? I am so mad at my sister who took my favorite toy and painted it. And my parent, who should know better and should beat the crap out of my little sister, is telling me to count to 10. What is going on? Well, what we know is that if you count to 10, one is you shifted topics. You're no longer thinking about your sister. Two is you're doing a breathing exercise. And you are trying to maintain that other self, which counts to 10. And very often you come out of it not as upset. There's a grown-up trick, which is from yoga, which is if you are upset and you put your tongue back and breathe with your tongue back, a few deep breaths, it will shift your upset. Now, the word shift means you're in a different self. And so the book makes that all obvious and a lot of fun because there's just a lot of fun examples from popular culture, from television shows, and so forth. And as I say, it was part of psychology, which many of you perhaps are studying, but it was skipped. They kind of skipped right into the part where Freud lets go of selves for other reasons. And psychology kind of leaves it. And it comes back periodically because it is the way people are. How was that for a one sentence answer?
It was wonderful. It's just there's so much to it. And I love your Symphony of Selves so much. And it's funny that you should mention fun. My life has been way more fun since I read your Symphony of Selves. I feel like I can allow the selves that I was sort of tepid or that had sort of like, oh, why is this is a strange part of my personality, or this is a strange thing.
But the nice thing, it takes the strange parts of your personality and accepts them.
Right.
There's a therapy system based on having selves. It's called IFS, Internal Family Systems. And it doesn't go as far as our book does because it's a therapy system and you can't get into therapy systems unless you need therapy. We're talking about normal, healthy people. And it turns out that the healthiest, most successful people inherently understand selves. So when you say, do you have selves? They say, oh yeah, of course. So
do you think that the single self assumption could contribute to the prevalence of difficult psychedelic experience?
Ooh, that's
of having one?
Question. If you usually you have a difficult psychedelic experience because because you become frightened. I mean, let's take the one that many of us have experienced, which is you're there and you've had the fractals and you may have been in castles and magnificent something or other, and then you realize that you're dying. And you think, I'm dying. Okay. And your mind says, yes, you are. and if you're not, see, this is where guides are wonderful, because you open your eyes and you say to the guide, total terror, I'm dying. And your guide says, great, man. Just go with it. And he holds your hands and you think, I have no idea what's going on, but my guide, who I respect, seems to think this is okay. I'll just close my eyes. If I'm going to die, it's not going to matter. And then, of course, what you find out is that the dying experience is your ego doing its final bullshit. Its final saying, I am so important. Remember that wonderful sequence in The Wizard of Oz where the little Toto the dog pulls the curtain back and there's the wizard with his little machine. He says, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Okay, but it's too late, and so forth. So what happens, what we now call, and it's called ego death, and it isn't really true at all. It's just the ego finally having to admit that it's a very small part of your self, of your system, of your being. So that's bad. That's the core. That's kind of the core of bad trips. The other, and one of my favorite quotes from people, because this is, most people don't take psychedelics in a very safe, in the best setting. He said, we were all having a terrific trip until the car caught on fire. Okay? Real car, real fire. Okay, that's a bad trip. And curiously, Hopkins did one of their big surveys where they got a couple of thousand people, and the question was, they had an earlier one. The question was, what's your best trip? And then discuss it. Fill in all the blanks. They had a different one that said, what's your worst trip? And discuss it. Now, in the best trip, they said, how important was this experience in your life? And the answer was obviously super meaningful, in the top 5 experiences of my life for many people. In the bad trip, it was almost the same number when asked how important or valuable the trip was. People didn't say it was pleasant, but they said it was a maximum learning experience in my life, of which there are very few that important. So we now are, we're trying to get the word bad out of the trip vocabulary and put in the word challenge. Okay? Because we like challenges. When I look at people who mountain climb, I look at that and I say, you want to be cold and sore and barely able to breathe. And you're telling me that's really fun. And they say, you really don't understand anything, do you? And I say, well, if I had a bad trip and I found myself on an endless mountain, Sisyphus being one of those guys, yeah, you learn from stressing your system, you learn from challenge. You also learn just as much from enormously pleasurable experiences. So sure, difficult trips are difficult. And that's why the same reason that when you're with a bunch of people and someone has to drive everyone home, it's called a designated driver. And they don't drink. And they don't want to be the designated driver every time. So that's a little bit of a discussion around that. Bad trips happen. Challenging trips are better. Getting something out of a bad situation, a negative situation, a painful situation. I was in a car wreck once, and I was really pretty bashed up. And I learned a lot in my recovery. I learned a lot about accepting help. I learned a lot about understanding that people could be kind and there was no way I could repay them, okay? I learned about other people's generosity. I also learned a lot about how to deal with pain. I don't want to do that again. But I got value from a very negative experience. And that's something we all talk about it. I don't support negative experiences. I think they're bad. They're not a good way to learn. Just as you say, well, I was in a really bad relationship and I learned a lot. I thought, yeah, but how about being in a really good relationship and learning a lot? Which would you choose?
So, definitely the good relationship. It
well,
makes me think of.
And there are people who say, no, man, you got to go through it. I say, okay, you got to go through
it. Don't make me do this. That was like Roquette, wouldn't he?
Right.
Salvador Roquette, he would give people huge doses and put on like war films.
Right.
And...
Salvador Roquette scares me to death.
Yeah.
And my feeling is it's just not necessary to do that. But he was so gifted that he made it for most people, I believe, genuinely beneficial.
Hmm. So many fascinating places to go. Again, just a hallway full of other hallways that I would love to keep exploring. We've got maybe time for one more question.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, what's your most optimistic vision of maybe physical and mental health? I did have this question worded most optimistic vision of a psychedelic future, but we can we can constrain it to physical and mental health.
Well, let me do the psychedelic future very quickly, which is the um, the whole monetization, or how can you make money out of psychedelics, is going to be bad. Okay, there's going to be a lot of people hurt, a lot of people cheated, a lot of people made rich who shouldn't be, who aren't us, and so forth. But from the ashes of that, a lot of very good things are happening. The world is shifting towards saying mental health is actually better than mental illness. Okay, now, um, it's I keep saying no elected official is going to stand up and say the reason I don't want our veterans to have access to MDMA and psychedelic therapy is because I want more of our soldiers to die and to commit suicide and to become drug addicts. Nobody's going to do that. You don't get elected on that. And there are very few human beings who would ever say that. So as the reality of the value of psychedelics continues to expand, it's getting easier and easier. I mean, right now there's, I don't know, like 6 states have bills to decriminalize various levels of psychedelics. That's fantastic. They're not going to pass probably this year, but Oregon passed, and the state didn't melt down, and um, there are still lots of perfectly happy right-wing Christians in Oregon who will not be disturbed by other people using psychedelics. So
Hmm.
my optimism is that the value of psychedelics is so obvious that it will eventually have to be accepted.
Hmm.
Now, what's mental health? What's the best mental health? Probably, probably reconnecting to the natural world in a very, very kind of extensive way, which is there's a term in Japanese which translates as forest bathing. And if you walk out under trees, you feel better. Now, there's 2 reasons. One is trees are wonderful beings and they happen to be friendly to humans. The other is they're continually dealing with viruses and bacteria that want to eat various parts of them. So they're continually putting out healing chemicals to protect themselves. And when you're walking among trees, you're literally getting bathed in healing molecules. Okay. And what I've found over the years is the closer you get to nature, the better you feel. And that's, again, super obvious. And we say, well, I live on the 12th floor of a 35-story apartment in a part of New York that people don't like. Well, um, if you can't um, visit plants, you can bring them in. And if you can't bring them in, you can look at pictures on Facebook.
Hmm.
And literally, a lot of my friends I know share pictures of beautiful animals and beautiful images. Um, there's a Facebook page called Passing Beauty, meaning beauty that is transitory. Um, and it's an open, you have to be invited to join it, but there's a couple of hundred people that just post things that make them feel good. Um, that's a very simple-minded view of mental health. That does not handle racism, inequality, poverty, illness, and all those other things, but it helps. And it's something everyone can do. So simple-minded, it's more or less one of those, well, if you could just tell us one good thing, what would you say? So that's what I'd say. And actually, small dogs are also very, very, very useful.
It's so accessible. It's so just there. It's just outside.
During the lockup, the lockdown, what I found is that I know so much more about it, almost every flowering plant in my neighborhood, because I would see them on a daily basis and I would be looking at them because that's who I was talking to. And I found, I don't want to lose that just because I'm able to be with human beings again.
Mm.
So if this was our last question, I'm just want to make it clear that this organization is really exciting to me, okay? Because particularly both the college units, because it's okay to talk about these things and it's okay to help each other and it's okay to share information and it's also okay to talk very arcane biochemistry that nobody else has ever wanted to talk about. And the citizen groups, because that's how culture changes, by helping each other and supporting each other and liking each other. And one of the things, again, I've worked with lots and lots of groups. I've been a consultant for years, and I go into rooms where everyone's mad at each other, and I'm supposed to facilitate and all that. I've also worked with groups of psychedelic researchers and so forth. And initially, I would be nervous because they're all like these really smart, big people who all run their own scene, and I'm going to help them, do something. They're nicer than any other group I've ever worked with, and they actually notice they're nicer. And I was looking at what happened, because something I would suggest, and they will all think that was terrible. And they would just shift it, and they would work with each other, and within about 4 minutes, we'd be doing something else. That's one of the things about people in the psychedelic world, is there's something about letting go of your ego, letting go of your personality, joining with nature again, that lasts into and shows itself into kindness. And kind of the Dalai Lama says, if you can't do anything else, try compassion.
Mm.
And we're good at that. Okay. So I'm really happy to be with all of you. And I've been glancing at the feed, and most of it goes a little too fast for me since I'm really trying to think of what I'm saying, but almost all of the questions had again a nice flavor, again a generous flavor, and that's the gift we give each other. So yay for you guys.
Jim, thank you so much for your words, for your presence here. This is yay for you. It feels like all we're doing is trying to align our truth with our behavior and our behavior with our truth. And
Yeah.
people keep asking how to be involved or how to help, and that really feels like the number one thing. And everything, it's an alignment of truth with behavior and alignment of behavior with truth, and everything else just sort of stems from that. So yeah.
The nice thing about just telling the truth is you don't have to remember anything.
It's a bit easier.
When you lie, we all do. When you lie, you have to remember. You have to kind of, it's a figuring out. And there was this wonderful study that showed people who are congenital liars, they actually have more of a certain kind of brain structure than people who aren't liars, because they need more, because they're running very complicated trips. So when, there were several of the questions, if we actually looked at this transcript, where I kind of wander off because I didn't quite deal with the question. But I felt that I would be excused from that because I was clearly trying to communicate something of value. And that's what I mean by that we're nice people. So.
Yeah. Well, Jim, thank you. Thank you so much again. I think we'll close out. I have just one little plug that I want to do. The Students for Sensible Drug Policy at CU Boulder is going to be hosting a psychedelics and cannabis symposium coming up with Dennis McKenna as the primary speaker. You can find info on that back on the event page. Jim, did you have anything you want to plug? Definitely your Symphony of Selves. Read that. It's wonderful.
Symphony of Selves better than I could, and if anyone wants to get Symphony of Selves because of this program, and they feel they've been tricked, they can drop me a note.
It's can't recommend it enough. And Jim.
So I think if anyone wants to follow my world, I have a website, and I tend to just put various presentations on it. And the other thing is very important, microdosingpsychedelics.com, that's no spaces, has a question, which is, what substance might be a problem if I'm either microdosing or macrodosing? Now it's mainly microdosing, and we have about 180 different substances, pharmaceuticals, herbs, supplements, all kinds of things that people have found that they can microdose while still using. A lot of people use microdosing to come down off of pharmaceuticals. And again, never get off a pharmaceutical except super, 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 super slowly, because they're kind of negatively addicting. It's very hard to get off them, but microdosing helps. So take a look at the site for questions, and make a difference in the world. You might as well. And if you don't know how to make a difference, plant a tree. That's the universe. Remember, the whole world breathes better if for every tree. So I may give up psychedelics entirely and just support trees. I don't know. Okay. And Clayton, everyone here needs to thank Clayton for doing the job he's doing, and for keeping this together, and for taking as much time out of his life as he does for this. And we're all grateful.
I'm really grateful to get to talk to you. It's all, you know, these moments make everything worth it. Jim, thank you so much for showing up here and just the impact on the world and my life. I really appreciate it. Right. So jamesfadiman.com, I posted it in there, psychedelicclub.com, and check out your Symphony of Selves. I love you guys. Thank you all for showing up here. It's been so good talking to you, Jim.
All right.
Goodbye for now.